My name is Matthew Whedon. I live in Avila Beach. I'm very much opposed to the seismic testing. I kayak in Avila Bay every week of the year, all year long. Just yesterday I was in the bay. I saw baby seals, baby sea otters. I can't imagine where they're going to go when this testing begins. I can't see that they would swim 50, 60 miles away or even further. And secondly, the cost of this testing has been told that the constituents of the Central Coast are going to have to pay for this, some $60, $70 million. PG&E is passing off the cost. Yet when you do just a simple research on the internet for seismic testing, it does not talk much about looking for earthquake faults. It says it's for oil and gas discovery. At 250 decibels, I'm wondering if this would give PG&E the data to look down 30,000 feet where deep ocean oil rigs could go, like the Deepwater Horizon. It was in the Gulf of Mexico, 2010. 5 million barrels of crude oil gushed from 5,000 feet. They could not cap it for months. I haven't heard much discussion about the seismic testing data being used for oil and gas discovery, but it seems like even in Peru, other places, when they've done this testing, it was not to look for earthquake faults. It was to look for places to put oil rigs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whedon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me pick up on colleagues' comments here. Maybe we have a couple of thoughts we can string together. I think we need to get it off the table. This is not about oil. This is not out there surveying oil. That's
well, if I could jump in on that,
sure.
Just to remind people, you know, when I first came to office in 2009, I wrote the letter to the Secretary of the Interior, Salazar, affirming our opposition to offshore oil. I voted, obviously, for that letter. So did Mr. Gibson. We have a ballot measure that passed in the 80s that requires any onshore oil facilities have to come before a vote of the people. So the nonsense about oil is nonsense. It's unfortunate because I think it ends up, you know, distracting from the legitimate and important issues. But that's nonsense. It always has been nonsense, whether we're talking about Mr. Gibson or Mr. Blakeslee. So that needs to be understood.
Let me just make two other observations on that matter. We're under state and federal moratorium against offshore oil drilling exploration, and there are already people who look out off our coast and want to drill there. The existence of this data, no matter what it shows, does not change the balance here. So it's not about oil. I think it is useful to speak to some people's concerns about, well, what would the regulators do with this data? What's the ultimate goal? And the question of surveying the geology is about trying to understand whether the plant is built to adequately withstand the maximum credible earthquake that might be expected there. The lesson of Fukushima is they were expecting 8, they got a magnitude 9, and the disaster is obvious. So we operate, and my colleagues have already expressed it, from a core conviction that we need to as fully and thoroughly understand the seismic earthquake hazard to Diablo Canyon as we possibly can. That doesn't contradict at this point the initial recommendation that we oppose what's before the Coastal Commission. The consequences of understanding that earthquake threat can be boiled down into three possible outcomes, and it's very simple, much more simple than it would be in practice. Either it's determined that the plant is designed to withstand the maximum credible earthquake, and that we don't have to be further concerned about that, or the plant is not designed to withstand the maximum credible earthquake, and it needs to be fixed, or that it's not designed to withstand the maximum credible earthquake and it needs to be closed. And I know there's deeply held convictions as to what should happen. I mean, there are people who have no problem. Carry on. Diablo is too important to worry about. Let it operate. There are others who would seek to close it tomorrow. But those are the decisions that are momentous decisions, that are consequential decisions, that we have to have information to reason with, to consider. And we're operating here in a highly imperfect regulatory environment, framework. The way that this is organized and the way that it's been executed is not the way it should be as we look at how we should make important decisions about something as important and consequential as nuclear power. We're also operating in an environment where we are asked to choose a course of action when we don't have all the facts we'd like to know. And that's a very difficult situation, but that's where we are, and that's what we have to do. So let me start with a string of ideas here that I think would be our position. That first of all, we start with the letter to state lands, which is on record in Coastal, and in our subsequent communication to Coastal indicate that the conditions outlined in that letter not having been met, that this board opposes the project before Coastal as it's proposed. Second, that we maintain a core concern that the earthquake hazard to Diablo Canyon is thoroughly and objectively analyzed. I think that's an important statement. And then on the way forward, I think ideas that colleagues have touched on as regards the matter of looking at the workup of data that's been collected onshore and the low energy work offshore would certainly be important to inform the kind of independent survey, the independent review that I have been asking be applied to this project all this year. In doing the design of a modern seismic survey such as this, the baseline of information that you gather from all previous work is an important component of how you decide where to go from here. And let me use, if I might, just briefly a medical analogy. That the business of doing a high-energy 3D offshore survey is like doing a very invasive diagnostic medical procedure. There is going to be impact, there's going to be discomfort, there could be potentially a scar. You wouldn't undertake that kind of invasive procedure without, first of all, having looked carefully at all the non-invasive things you could do. And if you were contemplating moving forward with that invasive medical procedure, you would want to know that who was doing it was properly trained and using the best equipment possible. You think of that, making that decision for yourself or your family. So that's the best analogy I could come up with for talking about what I've been asking for a long time, which is that independent review, and in fact, proper independent design of this survey. And that, again, a lot of complications with the regulatory framework that I don't want to get into at this point. But on the way forward, I think given our observations about not having immediacy or not having a deadline of this year that we can recognize, that the workup of the onshore data and the low energy offshore data is important in informing to deciding what happens next in terms of understanding our core concern. And Supervisor Meacham asked about, who decides whether full and fair compensation of the ocean-dependent industries, and it's more than commercial fishing. It is recreational fishing. It is diving. And the environmental issue, and the shore. Well, let me get to the environmental issues here in just a second. But the economic impacts have been very widely discussed, and we've heard from a number of affected interests here. And what I have, in talking to commercial fishing organizations from both boards, individuals, I've made it clear that this board, again, is already on record indicating that is a condition that we want to see fulfilled before any permit is issued. It is a negotiation, and the best I can determine from the conversation is that negotiation simply hasn't happened. A mediator has not been arranged, or at least has not been engaged and executed on a mediation. But I still think the principle remains that before this survey goes forward, our commercial interests dependent on the ocean need to have some certainty about how they're going to be treated, because there are potential impacts, both physical environmental impacts, perceptual impacts, things that they're going to have to deal with. So I would call on PG&E and the commercial interests to engage that discussion at a more fully, and it should remain an important part of our conditions. And then finally, on the environmental impacts, That's a tough one. The environmental impact report that State Lands issued was certified, and I asked them yesterday, the statute of limitations has run out, that impact report has not been challenged. Now, the Coastal Commission uses its own version of environmental review, so it's not particularly necessarily applicable to that EIR. But I would seek colleagues' advice as to how we talk about what more we want to see about the environmental impacts. The one impact that has come up since the State Lands Commission that I myself don't fully understand is the impacts to humans in the water. That's the new one for me. That's not one that I heard discussed at State Lands. That's one that I've heard brought up since. I have seen the plots that show 160 decibel levels at the shoreline based on some modeling. I've not heard a good plan as to how people are going to be protected, if indeed they need to be protected from that level of sound. That one's a concrete one. That one's obvious to me. Whether colleagues have other thoughts as to how that you want to talk about environmental impacts, I will just add my observation. I understand people's love of the ocean. I love the ocean. I'm on the ocean every chance that I possibly can get. I think that the most dire descriptions of what a seismic survey would do to the ocean environment are, I've said publicly, are not realistic. I think they come from a very deep-rooted connection to the ocean that a lot of people have, but in an area where we don't have all the facts, I think some folks have taken the interpretation of those impacts beyond what I consider realistic. That said, I don't have scientific studies to detail exactly what they are. How colleagues would want to respond to that question, I'd be open to suggestions.
From what I've heard over the course of the last couple of months, since this was last debated here at the board, there is, I think, a degree of uncertainty articulated about the extent of the environmental impacts to the marine environment. So I would simply put forth the concern about the potential impacts and some validation through, and Mr. Strickland made reference to other testing in the Gulf and off the coast of Peru where this has been done and there has been no adverse marine impacts noted. But then at the same time, he said there later on that this is the first time that there's been extensive mitigation measures put in place, and so I'm curious as to how they know if there haven't been further extensive follow-ups where testing has been done, that there isn't significant environmental impacts to the marine environment. And so I would ask for substantiation that that is indeed the case.
Sure.
And
Short of a refereed scientific paper, is that the kind of?
well, yeah, just have the experts debate this, because apparently there are ones that feel that there is potentially very significant environmental impacts, particularly to marine mammals, and we need to know that. And we had some discussion of that at our hearing in August. Some follow-up studies and that sort of thing, but I think we need to take a closer look, or at least recommend that before we go forward with this type of high-energy seismic study, that we have more information about the potential impact of the marine environment. I think we do need, as you suggested, some follow-up on the potential impacts to humans that may be in the water during testing, and how that's going to